Hello guys, welcome back. In this video, let us learn one more interesting service, that is DAX. What is that? DAX. So why do we use this DAX, sir? We have DynamoDB. Then why do we use this DAX? DynamoDB will provide you response in milliseconds, but this DAX will provide you response in microseconds. How this DAX will provide you response? In which time? In microseconds. So whenever you have a need to get your response fast, that is 10 times faster than DynamoDB, then you can use this DAX. So let's see how the DAX will look like. Let's see an example architecture where it contains DAX and your DynamoDB. You can see this real-time example scenario where client is requesting for your data. Now, what happens? The request will first reach to API gateway service. Then this API gateway will redirect your request to DAX cluster. So either it will send you a read request or write request. What is meant by reading, sir? Reading is nothing but getting data from DAX. So we call it as get type request. So what is writing? Writing is nothing but posting some data under your DynamoDB. That is nothing but post request. So from the API gateway, the request may send, that is either a read request, that is get request, or post request, that is write request, will be sent to first to DAX. Where this DAX is present? Under your VPC. Where this DAX is present? Under your VPC. Now, this DAX will check for data. So what are the requests you got? For that read request, is there any data which is present under this DAX or not? First, this DAX will check. So if there is no data, then the request will be forwarded to DynamoDB. In the DynamoDB, the request will find the particular hash key by using hashing your particular partition key. This DynamoDB find out where is your hash key, and for that particular hash key, whatever the item it has, that will be provided by this DynamoDB. And then this reaches back to DAX, where here your data is cached again. Now again the response will be sent back to client via API gateway. So this is the process which happens by using DAX. So when you use DAX, it provides you 10 times faster response compared to without using this DAX. That means if this DynamoDB will provide you response in less than within milliseconds, then this DAX provides you within microseconds your response. Let's write what are the points that we have seen till now. DAX is a service. It's not a DynamoDB option. It's a DAX is a service. This DAX is a fully managed service. That means you don't need to manage the infrastructure of this DAX under backend. Coming to this, DAX provides fast response. That is 10 times faster than response provided by DynamoDB. So this is one more point we have covered. This DAX provides response in microseconds, whereas DynamoDB provides you response in milliseconds. So that's why DAX is preferred compared to, this is one of the reason where we prefer DAX compared to DynamoDB. So till now we have seen comparison of DAX with DynamoDB. Now let's see full form of DAX. What is this DAX? DAX stands for DynamoDB Accelerator. What is this DAX? DAX stands for DynamoDB Accelerator. Let's see how the DAX deployment works. Actually, under DAX, there is a cluster. What is that? DAX cluster. In this DAX cluster, it will maintain multiple nodes. At least it will maintain minimum of 3 nodes. The first node we call it as primary, and everything will be other nodes only. Now in each node, it will maintain a in-memory cache. What does it maintain? It maintains a in-memory cache. So you can assume these nodes like the servers which are present in a cluster. You can assume this whole as a cluster where it maintains servers, where the servers here in the DAX cluster is nodes, where these nodes contain in-memory cache, where the first created node we call it as primary node and all the others are other nodes. You can see the first node we call it as primary node, or else you can say one node we call it as primary and the other nodes we call them as read replicas. So in a DAX cluster, you can create up to 10 nodes. Up to max of 10 nodes you can able to create in a cluster. Let's see after putting DAX how the interaction will be. Client requests for your application. Then your application sends a request to your DAX. Instead directly to your DynamoDB first, your application sends request to your DAX. Now this DAX cluster, DAX manages a cluster of nodes where you have seen previously how it was, where which responds from caching data from DynamoDB tables and handling incoming read requests. So when DAX receives a read request, it first checks if the request data is already cached in DAX cluster or not. If data is found in cache, then DAX returns it directly to the application, which helps to reduce the latency to read your operation. If let's say the requested data not found in the cache of your DAX cluster, then this DAX, what does it do is it forward your request to DynamoDB to retrieve data. Then DynamoDB responds to the request and sends the response to whom? DAX. Now DAX caches the data before returning it to your application. Subsequent requests, then your application will send the response to the client. If any subsequent request for the same data, then the data is already saved in the DAX, right? So from the cache in the DAX clusters, which is present in the DAX nodes, you got the response from there. So DAX acts as an intermediate between your application as well as DynamoDB. So caching frequently accesses data to improve the performance and reduce load on DynamoDB tables. It distributes traffic across DAX clusters, handles cache lookups and interactions with DynamoDB as if needed, then it maintains those as well. So can we say DAX cluster is a separate entity and DynamoDB is a separate entity? Yes. In this architecture, you can see DAX cluster is a separate entity and DynamoDB is a separate entity. So can we say there is an architecture behind? Yeah. So for this, where to deploy these nodes? That we need to specify, right? Yes. We need to specify where to deploy our nodes. So how to specify, sir? So while creating your DAX cluster, it will ask you for in which VPC you want to provide your nodes and in which subnet you want to provide your nodes. Those two things you need to specify. And one more thing, that is security group. When when creating a DAX cluster, when creating a DAX cluster, we need to configure the following aspects. that is DAX cluster name we need to configure, right? In order to identify your cluster within AWS account, you need to configure this. And we are creating nodes, right? For these nodes, we need to even select instance type, right? That we need to select. So we need to select it based on compute and memory services. There are different node types available. So based on our instance type need, we need to select our instance type. And coming to how many nodes we want, that we also need to specify. If we specify, the first node will be primary and other will be the read replicas. So after that, we also need to specify in which VPC my DAX cluster will be. That also we need to specify. And we also need to specify subnet selection. That is, we may need to specify which VPC subnets to use. If you have specified requirements or preferences, then we need to select it, or else DAX automatically selects subnets within the chosen VPC to deploy our nodes of the DAX cluster. So finally, you have security group. So DAX automatically creates and manages your security group for your nodes within your cluster. These security groups control inbound and outbound traffic and from the nodes, ensuring secure communication with your VPC. So finally, we have encryption. It is an optional. You can enable this encryption at rest for DAX cluster to encrypt data stored in cache. You can choose to use AWS managed keys like KMS or custom managed keys. So the data stored in the memory, cache memory will be cached. Even you can use attacks though. So you first need to concentrate on while creating cluster, you need to provide cluster name and how many nodes you want and what is the node type, instance type you want, and do you want to encrypt your memory and which VPC you want to place this cluster, and specifying the subnets. It's optional. If you want, you can select if you have specific specification. And security groups by default it will be created so that it can able to interact with this DAX cluster can able to interact with your VPC, because this cluster is created under your VPC, right? Yes. So once you have configured these aspects, you can able to create your cluster, and AWS handle the providing and management of these all resources which are required to run your cluster. So actually how this DAX cluster will get the request is, whenever your client requests for something in your database, then this API gateway will send the request to this DAX cluster. Under this DAX cluster, it will be look like this. So first your request reaches to where DAX endpoint. First your request reaches to where DAX endpoint. From there, by using load balancer, of your DAX clusters, your request will be sent to nodes. So under the node, it will check for in-memory cache to provide the response. If there is a response available in in-memory cache, then in any one of the node, then it provides you the response. If there is no in-memory cache, then any one of the node will request again to DynamoDB. What? It requests again to DynamoDB. Then this DynamoDB again send back the request to whatever the node. Then this will cache that data, and it will even replicate that data to other replications, and then it sends back to DAX, and then it will send from the DAX endpoint. It will again send back to your API gateway. From the API gateway, your client will receive the response. So let's focus more on this DAX cluster. So whenever request is receiving by this DAX cluster, how it is receiving? By using some endpoint. What endpoint? DAX endpoint it is receiving. the data. Then by using what it will be sending back the data? By using TCP protocol. By using which protocol? TCP protocol. And by using a port number that is 8111, it sends the data out. By using which port number? 8111 port number and TCP protocol, this DAX sends the data out. So whenever receiving request, it will receive by using DAX endpoint. Whenever sending the response, DAX will send by using this TCP protocol and by using this 8111 port number. Let's say in another application, you want to connect with this DAX. Then how do you connect with this DAX? By using an EC2 instance. Let's say in another application, you want to connect this DAX by using EC2. Then how to connect by using EC2? You first need to provide this DAX endpoint to your EC2 so that you can able to request this DAX. Then how do your EC2 will receive the response from this DAX? So it need to allow this port number and this protocol, right? So in the inbound rules of your EC2 instance, you must need to provide these two. Allow this port number and this protocol response to the EC2 instance under security group. Then only you can able to access this response. So that's why you need to remember this response protocol and port number. DAX protocol is what? TCP, and port number is what? 8111. Here again, two types of requests are there. Here again, two types of requests. So what type of request does this DAX cluster will provide you the response? This DAX cluster will provide you the response only for read requests. Other than read requests, it won't process that request. It will send that request directly to DynamoDB. You don't process that request. So what are the possible requests do I have for my DynamoDB? I have read request and update request, and I have delete request, and I have write request as well. So except read request, other requests will directly send to DynamoDB, and it just sends the response back to the client. You don't do anything. You don't cache the other responses. If if the request is read request, then only what does it do? This DAX will try, this DAX cluster will try and process the request. If it has the data cached, then it will provide the response. Even though it is read request and data is not cached, it will send the request to DynamoDB only. So from the received data, it will cache the data and sends the response. So if the request is not read request, then it won't do anything. It just forwards the request to DynamoDB. So there the processing happens, that is a writing or updation or deletion, whatever the thing may be, it will happen under there, and whatever the result which is provided by the DynamoDB to this cluster, or else you can say DAX, this will return back to the client. This will be sent back to the client in this mode. One more important point is whenever you want to perform control plane operations, that is a table related operations, that is creating table or deleting table, like those operations, your request directly sent to DynamoDB. This DAX cluster won't present in between. Your request will directly send to DynamoDB. This DAX won't take the request. DAX does not process any requests related to table operations and management. For example, if you want to create table or update table or delete tables, not table data, related to tables, then this DAX do not process those requests. So this is the content that you need to know about DAX. So I hope you understood this video and you got the content about DAX. If you feel this video is contentful, then please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get the latest updates. Thanks for watching again, and see you back in the next video with another interesting topic. Until then, bye bye guys.